I am so honored to be speaking today to Bernardine Evaristo, the Booker Prize winning author of Girl, Woman, Other, which is just one of my favorite books in recent memory. It is an extraordinary piece. Bernardine is also a professor of creative writing at Brunel University in London. And thank you so, so much for joining me today and talking to me about the book.
Well, it's my pleasure.
I am so blown away by the style of the book. How did you choose that writing style? How did that evolve?
For people who don't know the book, I use very little in the way of punctuation. I really just have commas and I have a few full stops, but you could probably count the number of full stops that there are. But when you look at the text on the page, it kind of looks a bit like poetry, but it's not quite poetry, but it enables you to read it really easily. And I have to say that because if people hear that it's a little bit experimental, well, it is experimental, then they might be put off reading it, and we don't want anyone to be put off reading it. So what happens is maybe it might take a page or two to get into it, but it's kind of shaped on the page like this, and your eye just follows the text. And because there aren't full stops, I think it's hopefully a very free-flowing reading experience. And for me, it was a very free-flowing writing experience. And I found it really liberating because when you get rid of punctuation, it's really interesting. Language can come alive in kind of a different way. And I found that I could be inside the women's heads and outside their heads. And it's almost like a stream of consciousness as well, but it's not quite that. So these are some of the things that were at play when I was writing in that form.
It brings so much emotion to it, to feel the kind of breath and the natural pauses of emotion. It really is so extraordinary. Was it a political choice, like not to have capital letters for names? And
yeah, definitely political. I mean, I began in theatre, actually. I trained as an actress and I began working in theatre in the 80s. And I did not want to write traditional theatre because I felt that I wasn't part of the tradition of theatre in this country. As a child of, my father was a Nigerian immigrant, and I was very much part of this kind of alternative theatre scene where we were creating our own theatre and creating our own theatre forms. And that was a political act. And that's something that's continued with my writing ever since, that I've been really interested in finding the form that fits what I have to say, rather than fitting what I have to say in any of the traditional forms. And in this case, it means not writing in traditional sentences and not having traditional paragraphs. And also having a novel that has 12 equal co-protagonists as well.
I love that, and it makes so much sense that that's your background, because the characters are so well developed and so completely rounded, and they do feel like central figures even when they each one kind of is connected to the last. How did you come up with that structure, and why did you want that kind of interrelated women's lives as this sort of center of your story?
So the characters, the 12 characters, kind of grew out of each other. So I started with a character called Carol, who I'm going to read from. And she's a young woman. She's coming from a very working class part of London. Well, it was then. It's becoming gentrified, and that's the history of London anyway. And she's the daughter of Nigerian immigrants, and she ends up going to Oxford and becoming a banker. And when I was writing her section, her mother came into her story, because with most of these characters, I go back to their childhood. And I thought, oh, I really like the mother. She's a Nigerian immigrant. She's got a degree in maths. She comes to the UK. She can't get work befitting her degree, and she ends up a cleaner. And she also a single mother because her husband dies. So she's raising Carol on her own.
I don't know, maybe you want to, I would love to hear you read the Carol section.
Yeah. So I'll read Carol. Now, I've just told you a little bit about Carol. So now she's on her way to work in the morning, and she works in the City of London, which is the kind of traditionally the business and financial centre of London. And this is kind of like what's going on in her mind. Carol steps onto the silver steps of the escalator. Oops, sorry.
No problem.
Along with the rest of the commuting populace in their sombre office pallets, as it elevates them skywards from below ground to the street level of Bishopsgate. She's headed for an early morning meeting with a new client based in Hong Kong, whose net worth is multiple times the GDP of the world's poorest countries. She's thinking he'd better not do a double take when she enters the executive meeting room. One long glass wall looking out onto the city, the other bearing a massive splash of tax-deductible artwork that cost the price of a Zone 2 townhouse. She's thinking he'd better not look at her as if she should be attached to a trolley bearing flasks of coffee, assortments of teas, herbal, green, grey, Ceylon, and those individually packaged corporate biscuits. She's used to clients and new colleagues looking past her to the person they are clearly expecting to meet. She will stride up to the client, shake his hand firmly, yet femininely, while looking him warmly, yet confidently in the eye, and smiling innocently, and delivering her name unto him with perfectly clipped received pronunciation, showing off her pretty, thank God they're not too thick, lips, coated in a discreet shade of pink, baring her perfect teeth as he adjusts to the collision between reality and expectation. So that's a taster of Carol, and I just wanted to get inside the skin of somebody who's a Black woman, working class, who's worked her way up into the corporate world, and yet she's always conscious of how she's being perceived and the fact that she's never automatically given the respect that she feels she deserves. I think with all the women, they've all got these sort of struggles, but the book isn't about struggle, it's about celebration as well, and it's about lots of different things. But they all have these realities which are to do with being primarily Black British women or womanson, because one character is non-binary, in this country, in the UK.
There's a part at the end where Roland talks about the kind of being, I don't know if pigeonholed is the right word, but even like kind of rejecting the label of Black intellectual and like disdaining that and not wanting to be defined by that. How do you relate to that that kind of position that you hold?
I guess the book does have a lot of arguments going on, you know, and a lot of different, you know, a lot of people, a lot of the characters, main characters, subsidiary characters are coming at all these kind of issues with lots of different perspectives. And you're absolutely right. Roland does not want to be a spokesperson for Black people. He wants to see himself as an individual. But unfortunately, in this society, that's not the case. So my perspective is, you know, I grew up in a London suburb, and it was a very white area at the time when I was growing up. I come from a mixed race family. My mother's white, father Nigerian, 8 children, very much not fitting into that very white society of all those years ago, talking about 60s and 70s. Mm. And then coming of age at drama school, where there are 4 other Black women, and claiming my Black identity, which is an identity that I've claimed ever since. But within that, I am mixed race. So I'm, you know, I will break it down. I am mixed race. I am biracial. Mm-hmm. And these terms change. We used to be called half caste in this country, and then that changed. And of course, coloured was a term, and then that changed. So I'm Black, but I also acknowledge the fact that I'm biracial, mm-hmm. but while also acknowledging that race is a social construct, doesn't actually exist. But hey, it's a lived reality, so we talk about it like that. And then that is also the perspective from which I create my fiction and my books and my writing and everything that I do, because I really want to contribute to the culture as a Black person, because there are so little of us, so few of us doing that. And so I have been labeled a Black writer all my life, all my creative life as a professional. And I've had sort of, I would say, changing relationship to it. There was a time when I kind of objected to it because it felt like it was pigeonholing and it was defining me solely by my race. And that's not the case with white writers, because we don't talk about white writers.
No, right.
That's the default, right? That's what we consider to be normal. But when you're a person of color, then we identify your race. But to be honest, latterly, you know, maybe the last 10, 15 years, I have increasingly claimed it as something to be proud of, and also to acknowledge that that is the perspective that I'm writing from, and I want people to know that.
It's so incredible to explore kind of the very specific cultural differences between different members of the sort of African diaspora, I guess. Why is it important for you to differentiate between Nigerian background, Ghanaian background, Caribbean, like that each one is so incredibly specific?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. No one's asked me that. So I've done so many interviews, but I haven't been asked that either. So I think it's the differences that Britain had an empire. Britain owned a quarter of the world. At one point, up until probably the last colonies were until the 70s. It may still have one or two around the world. And a lot of African countries were part of the British Empire, and a lot of Caribbean countries were part of the British Empire. And there are about 30-something Caribbean countries, and I think it's 52 or 53 African countries. And all of those countries they may have English, a lot of them, as the sort of lingua franca, but a lot of them actually, they have hundreds, in some cases, hundreds of languages spoken. So there are hundreds of different social groups in some of those countries, not all of them. Say Nigeria has a lot of spoken languages. And so these are very, very, as you say, distinct cultures. Right. So when people came to the UK, they came from very different countries. So even though the British people would have seen them as black, my dad came from Nigeria in 1949, and the British people would not have distinguished between Africa, the country called Africa, or the country called the Caribbean. They wouldn't have distinguished, but actually the identities of those immigrants were very specific, very culturally specific. So writing this story about 12 primarily Black British women, I had to make each one specific. So some of them are immigrants coming from abroad, and a lot of them are British born, but I distinguish with all of them. You know where their ancestry is, because that's the reality here.
I am so grateful for your time and your
thank you for this
and your book, and I'm super honored to get to talk to you, and I'm very grateful for your writing, which
thank you
so much joy and beauty and a lot to think about. So thank you.